because I was thinking, hey, things are probably nearing about as bad as they can get, right? And no, I just wanted to pop in while I've got the space and, okay, look. These videos run on a website called The Escapist, and they're about, for the most part, escapism, and I know that's what you come here for and what I try to deliver, and when it comes to the question of how you can or what's the correct amount or way or even should you escape, during times when it feels like that's just impossible and for some people literally impossible, and maybe escapism itself is an almost selfish-sounding notion, honestly, I don't know. I don't think there's one single answer for that anyone can give because it's a personal, individual thing that's different for everyone else. Just like I said last episode, it's okay not to be okay. That kind of means you have to find your own level, and that goes for when you can and cannot check out of the signal and the noise too, I guess. That's the best I've got. I mainly bring this up because, yeah, we do mostly video games here, and over the weekend we saw Sony cancel the PS5 reveal event, and Activision cancel a similar reveal for whatever the next Call of Duty is going to be, both for the same reasons of not wanting to do it because there's this whole situation of both an ongoing plague and now days of protest over tragedy and police brutality morphing into riots and more police brutality, and now who knows what comes next, but probably nothing good. And a whole lot of people are very upset about this, and a lot more people are upset at the first group of people for not having their priorities straight, and I mean, that's the same basic issue, right? Where do you put a balance between the understandable desire of people who want catharsis, pressure release, moment of joy, even just simple distraction of entertainment versus the frankly more viscerally understandable feeling of, dude, grow up, there's more important things going on than your video game commercial. I mean, I should hope that which thing you should be more upset about is not really an arguable position, no matter how removed you feel from the events on the ground, people are dead, but there's a point at which 1,000 pinpricks do add up to a wound, and then what? Like I said, I don't really have an answer to how you should feel, but in terms of reacting, yeah, I think it's not unreasonable to ask that even the most disappointed gamers err on the side of deference, which thankfully has largely been the case. It's especially worth considering that it's not just a matter of virtue signaling or playing to media optics. These kind of reveals are never just push-a-button trailer uploads. They involve teams of devs, speakers, presenters, streamers, whole mobilizations of, real people with real lives and feelings of their own, who may not be in the right state of mind or emotion to do this right now under the circumstances themselves, especially with how fluid those circumstances are. I mean, you don't want to be this guy.
I have some sad news to report. A small puppy, not unlike Lassie, was just run over in the parking lot. And now it's time for the comedy stylings of Homer Simpson.
Are you ready to laugh? Oh, that poor dog. I said, are you ready to laugh?
Quiet, you awful man.
I mean, does that make sense? I hope so. Anyway, as before, it's okay not to be okay. And also, we need to be okay with others' version of not being okay. Alright? Alright. Anyway, for absolutely no reason in particular, here's an episode about dim-witted and incompetent police officers. It's possible I'm dating myself via reference here, but have you ever heard of a group of people or an operation being referred to as KEYSTONE KOPS in nickname or style? Or perhaps you're a gamer old enough to recall a police-oriented Atari chase platformer called KEYSTONE KOPS and wondered exactly what it had to do with keys or stones. It's one of those phrases that's hung around in the ether of popular lexicon for a bizarrely long time, even though it has kind of a weirdly specific meaning here, referring to elaborate silent movie slapstick comedy-style set pieces involving teams of cartoonishly inept policemen, derived from a source that was fairly short-lived in its day and not at all popular or well-remembered long after. Maybe the name is just fun to say. Anyway, the KEYSTONE KOPS were a recurring comedy plot device, see what I mean about this being niche, it wasn't even an official series or anything, that appeared in an otherwise unrelated series of early 1900s silent movie comedies from Keystone Studios producer Max Sennett, aka the father of movie comedy. Sennett produced a slew of hit slapstick short features under the Keystone name, often built around the antics of turn-of-the-century physical comedy megastars like Mabel Normand and Fatty Arbuckle, and having observed French silent comedies of a few years earlier employing the visual conceit of running gendarmes as a visual gag, and George Méliès playing off a similar riff in the chaotic climax to his 1905 trick film, The Scheming Gambler's Paradise, came to frequently build their stories to epic finales that would call for the intervention of the law, at which point everything would descend into total madness, as the law would be represented by a squad of Keystone's best stuntmen and bit players as incompetent, zany policemen whose wacky antics would only make the situation worse. Audiences enjoyed these gags so much and so positively associated them with the Keystone Films brand that even though the cops themselves were only the main players in 2 or 3 of the films, the other films where they would show up at the end or somewhere towards the middle to participate in one chase scene would come to include the Keystone Kops as part of the featured cast billing, and while popular, this really only went on for about half a decade as a new in-production trend, though given the nature of film production and release at the time, the shorts remained in circulation and pop culture notoriety for a while thereafter. They'd be referenced in other films and cartoons, and ripped off, of course, and even revived as nostalgic tribute years later in sound features like Abbott and Costello Meet the Keystone Kops. And of course, at the time, plenty of other studios and film comedians would borrow the general concept of bumbling idiot cop just as Keystone had in the first place. In fact, up until the 1930s, comedy relief or ineffectual plot device was the main form movie audiences would expect to see police in, Keystone or not. As hard as it is to believe today, where you can't change the channel without hitting a Dick Wolf show, for the most part, early 20th century American popular culture didn't take police very seriously or think of them as de facto heroes. Western lawmen, special investigators, private eyes like Sherlock Holmes, sure, but cops? Not really. Cops were generally plot points fiction either dealt with or avoided to the needs of a given storyline. And to most filmmakers like Max Sennett, who knew that film audiences of the day were overwhelmingly poor and working class, they were easy targets of feel-good anti-authority ridicule. They had fancy uniforms you could get dirty, funny hats you could knock off, and his audience was more likely to think of them as a hassle in their daily lives, not helpers. Now, of course, that's a lot different from how Hollywood tends to do police characters now, so what changed? Well, I mean, the whole world. We're talking movies from over a century ago, but specifically, the movie business and the police business started to need each other, basically. See, toward the end of the 1910s, the American movie industry, having moved to Los Angeles and grown into a powerhouse on the West Coast, got big enough to annoy the rest of the US media, resulting in sensationalized news coverage of Hollywood morality scandals, culminating in, but by no means only including, the salacious Fatty Arbuckle trial that drove various government entities to crack down, with police often on their side. After all, in 1910, the International Association of Chiefs of Police had adopted a resolution condemning the film industry as a whole because, and I quote, police were often made to look ridiculous. But heading into the age of the talkies, which also tracked with the rise and fall of Prohibition, the rise and sticking around forever after that of organized crime, and thus more intensified policing thereof, law enforcement came to need cultural makeovers, and Hollywood, well, Hollywood needed breaks. They needed permits to shoot on location on the West Coast, security to watch their sets, and most importantly, people on the inside of law enforcement who could make indiscretions by troublemaking and hard-living stars not make the papers or disappear entirely. One hand could perhaps wash the other. And that's basically what happened. Cops became righteous heroes on movies and TV. LA became a playground for the film and later TV industry to effectively act with near-legal immunity within a certain extent. Of course, by that point, the Keystone Kops were already old enough to be an aforementioned nostalgia property, and it certainly didn't mean that people stopped making funny crime films, but the days of holding them up as specifically objects of mockery without some kind of countervailing repercussions would take a long time to come back to the mainstream consciousness. Even modern sitcoms like Brooklyn Nine-Nine or raunchy comedies like Police Academy ultimately want you to root for the funny characters as heroes. Would there ever be room for a Keystone Kops of today, something that's as savagely silly about real-life crime fighting as The Boys or Kick-Ass is about superheroes? I'm not really sure, but it'd sure be something to see someone take a swing at, and there's definitely a brand name waiting for it. Our previous episode, for completely random, untopical, not at all broader discussion-worthy reasons, was about the silent movie comedy franchise The Keystone Kops, and more broadly, how they belong to an early 20th century mainstream comedy tradition of portraying common police officers as buffoonish figures of incompetence and ridicule that very suddenly disappeared from American cinema when the more established Hollywood film industry and Los Angeles Police Department, and later the FBI, needed one another's help in the image furnishing department from the post-World War I era onward. For reasons of time, what that shorthand explanation and focus on the film side and the rise and fall of the Keystone Kops specifically necessarily brushed over pretty quickly is that even after the movie switched over to the cops, they're your friends who you can trust and who absolutely know what they're doing and conduct themselves in a professional manner as the default mode of screen portrayal for the boys in blue, their actual level of screen presence didn't actually change all that much. Crime films were always popular, but you'd seldom describe most made before the late 60s as cop movies like Dirty Harry or Lethal Weapon. The main characters were usually criminals or even gangsters themselves, normal people caught up in crimes or investigations, amateur detectives or private eyes, and if they were actual police or police detectives, that profession would either be incidental or only a complication to the bigger plot. The cops, like their Keystone predecessors, were mainly still supporting players who participated in action scenes, delivered exposition or human plot devices who encountered crimes to incite the plot, or collected criminals after they'd been caught at the end. You just weren't supposed to laugh at them anymore, and this was by design. Most screenwriters operating from the rules of theater and fiction writing believed that actual police work was boring as on-screen action, and anything that would be exciting about it, i.e. the really really nasty crimes that you couldn't depict at the time, or the really corrupt police stuff that the film industry was deliberately whitewashing to maintain good relations with local departments couldn't be shown. Plus, it interfered with the drama. As Alfred Hitchcock put it in various forms over the years, people in suspense films don't go to the police because then there is no suspense. What changed was the arrival of television, and specifically a single actor, writer, director, and producer named Jack Webb, who, while researching a role as a forensic detective, observed the day-to-day grind of an ordinary police station and hit on an inspiration of his own: the boring paperwork side of policing. Interviewing witnesses and suspects, gathering evidence, working out clues, filing and making arrests could be compelling drama if one was to strip it down bare, took the audience through it step by step without pretense or false melodrama, and especially if you could base the stories on real cases as a gimmick. In effect, Webb had invented the police procedural, which he debuted as a 1949 radio series called Dragnet, which ran until 1957 and was so popular it spun off a TV version in 1951, and that version itself was not only popular, it's probably one of the most influential and culture-shaping shows in history. Even if you've never seen or heard of it, you probably know the theme music.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Dragnet, the TV show, would air in several different formats in terms of color, black and white, length, cast, title, etc., from 51 to 59, and then relaunch a second version in 1967 that would run until 1970. And then in reruns, pretty much forever. The constant across the series would always remain Jack Webb himself, who initially didn't even want to star, but was convinced by producers that his unique line delivery from the radio show was key to the brand as Sergeant Joe Friday.
What were you doing between 3:30 and 5:30 today?
I was laying up down there by the yards, right where they found me.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
Did you see anybody? Talk to anybody?
Like who?
Like a couple of little girls.
A no-nonsense, all-business cop who in each episode would be assigned a case, which we were told was based on a real one from the files of the LAPD, and solve it through clean, proper police detective work, after which audiences would be informed of the legal fates of the arrestees. This was a killer formula, and unlike anything anyone had ever seen at the time, Webb's man of iron wrapped in shoe leather persona as Friday was a hit with audiences, as well, and the high realism gimmick reinforced by Friday's iconic Just the Facts catchphrase changed the way TV and movies depicted police pretty much forever. Everything from Dirty Harry to Bullet to Hill Street Blues, NYPD Blue, The Wire, Homicide, Law & Order, Chicago PD, even more esoteric crime films like Seven or Training Day or whatever else on down, they're all pretty much descendants of or reactions to or against Dragnet in some way, and not necessarily in the most positive sense.
What about the 55,000 Americans who will die on the highways this year? That's nearly 6 or 7 times the number that'll get killed in Vietnam. Why aren't you up in arms about that? Or is dying in a car somehow moral?
See, whereas early Hollywood moguls had more or less made a mutually shady Faustian bargain where both guys think they're Mephistopheles deal with law enforcement leaders to put a polished shine on the profession on screen in exchange for the same in real life, Jack Webb was a genuine fan of police. A conservative Catholic who'd been raised poor by a single mother, Webb looked up to the police and identified with them as fellow working-class guys increasingly out of step in post-war America, and when his technical advisors and contacts on Dragnet made it clear that his series' access to real equipment, cars, locations, case files, and even personnel for extras would be a lot more open so long as his scripts consistently upheld and corrected the image of police in general and the LAPD specifically relative to how the media portrayed them otherwise as just and decent, he was more than happy to do so.
You're a college man. She'd like to have seen you land a job with a little more status attached. Is that it?
I guess that's part of it.
But not all of it. I think maybe I can understand how she feels. And maybe she's right, Culver. It's awkward having a policeman around the house. You throw a party and a badge gets in the way. All of a sudden, there isn't a straight man in the crowd. Everybody's a comedian. And then there's always the one who wants to know how many apples you stole. All at once, you lost your first name. You're a cop, a flatfoot, a bull, a dick, John Law. You're the fuzz, the heat, you're poison, you're trouble, you're bad news. They call you everything, but never a policeman. Maybe she's right.
Dragnet's vision of policing certainly wasn't rose-colored, but it was certainly 100% pro-cop. Joe Friday was a moral paragon, the world was a dangerous place, and the LAPD did what they had to do to protect the good people from the bad people. Just the facts, according to them. And this established a long tradition of even more involved back-and-forth cooperation between the popularity of TV procedurals like Dragnet and the police who worked as advisors that has a lot to do with why, just for example, internal affairs are usually bad guys in cop shows even today, or why you so rarely see extreme interrogations get bad intel or unjust brutality in general, all of which serve to make Webb, along with John Wayne, probably the preeminent, actually popular right-wing pop culture figure of the 1960s, meaning that even as Dragnet fell out of coolness into the 70s and 80s as an immortally syndicated rerun, its iconography and endlessly imitatable Joe Friday character morphed into a go-to camp comedy parody figure and instant laugh-getter for baby boomer and Gen X comedians, which led to this.
Would you say that these look like the breasts of a 43-year-old woman?
No, they don't, Miss Wiss. They're quite impressive. Bordering on spectacular.
Ma'am, you know I hate to admit it, Streebak, but for once in your life, you're right. This is good coffee.
Okay, so here's what happened here. During his tenure on Saturday Night Live, Dan Aykroyd demonstrated a pretty good version of a Jack Webb Joe Friday impression, and since, as we've discussed, many Hollywood business decisions from the mid-70s to the late 80s were made based around just piles of cocaine, someone decided that Aykroyd doing the Joe Friday voice could plausibly be the premise of an entire movie, so in 1987 they decided to make a Dragnet feature as a satirical comedy with Aykroyd as the adult son of the original Joe Friday, who has the same outdated 50s personality but in wacky present-day Los Angeles, partnered with a hip wisecracking partner played by a still-in-comedy mode Tom Hanks.
Your new partner.
There's a dress code for detectives in robbery homicide. Section 3-605, .10, .20, .22, .24, .70, .8.
Dragnet, a new generation of courage.
Thank God it's Friday!
Just the facts, ma'am.
The movie is actually pretty funny, mostly because it's got funny people in it, though there's not really much to it, and other than the basic joke of a guy who talks and acts like Jack Webb sure would be out of place in LA today, it doesn't really take any opportunity to say anything meaningful, humorously or otherwise about the 50s, 80s juxtaposition, and the plot is a hodgepodge about conspiracies involving a millionaire pornographer, a religious leader, and a fake pagan cult, which sounds more interesting than it actually is. Still, it's got laughs, though these days, if it's remembered at all, it's probably for the infamously absurd tie-in hip-hop track recorded by the Stars, really, to promote the film via MTV. Yes, this existed. If you've ever wondered what the whitest thing ever could be, Tom Hanks and Dan Aykroyd as cops rapping the Miranda rights would have to be up there.
But don't you know we really ought to read them their rights?
Read them their rights. Read them their rights.
Well, I'm here tonight to rap about your rights, cause right now you're in trouble. You don't have to say nothing at all. Y'all got two calls and you better make them on the double.
We're a dangerous mob, and it is our job to bust you all for being violent. While we are here, let's state it clear.
You have the right to remain silent.
Now you know what you've been doing is a serious crime.
And you'll probably be doing some serious time.
In case you might be worried about the friends you lose.
At least I get to see you on the evening news.
You know what's really amazing is, they made cop rock after this. Clint Eastwood has a new movie out because it wouldn't be Oscar season without the entertainment press being forced to once again act out their internal daddy issues with the fossilized auteur who put the attic in problematic fave, and said film has been mired in political media controversy because it wouldn't be an election year without Dirty Harry making that same entertainment press grapple uncomfortably with how much they used to respect him. There's no one in the chair, but the Emperor is a little underdressed. Anyway, the movie is called Richard Jewell, and this isn't a review of it, but if you care, it's not especially good, and I say that as someone who thinks Eastwood has in fact continued to make good films up to pretty recently. There's good interplay and a solid buddy story between Sam Rockwell and Paul Walter Hauser in the leads, but the rest of it is a melodramatic cartoon that veers between sanctimonious and trashy point scoring, adding up to one of the worst films you're likely to see a collection of exceptionally talented people make this year, and more evidence that Sam Rockwell really needs to find a new niche outside of Oscar bait dramas about empathizing with disenfranchised white dudes. The film is a dramatization of events surrounding the terrorist bombing of the 1996 Olympics, centering on Hauser's Jewel, the odd but evidently decent security guard who noticed the bomb and whose insistence on investigating it likely minimized casualties in the ensuing explosion, but whose brief notoriety as an unlikely hero turned ugly for him when leaked reports of FBI investigators having considered him as among the bombing suspects, guy who found the bomb, at least question him and all, and troublesome elements of his own backstory as a failed police officer with potentially undiagnosed personality issues became a media sensation and late-night TV punchline shortly after, leading the FBI to pressure agents to refocus on him despite a lack of evidence and effectively upended his life in the process. It's a deeply sad and quintessentially 1990s Americana story, an indictment of how an ignorant, easily terrified, and fundamentally impatient mass audience demands immediate answers in defiance of facts, and a craven, bottom-line chasing, lowest common denominator media, all too eager to fill their trough, to the point where truth, innocent individuals, supposed agents of law and justice itself, are all just scraps to be slopped out for hog feed, and an honest version would indict the entire diseased culture, from the shrieking public calling for a head, anyone's head, to the media that amplifies them, to the supposed lawmen who bent to both as the guilty parties in this person's abject torment. But in Clint Eastwood's version, it's basically all the fault of exactly one mean and nasty news reporter lady who did it because she's a big mean ol' witch, pretty much. Olivia Wilde plays this character, Kathy Scruggs, the name of a real person who was one of the main local Atlanta journalists who broke and then reported on parts of the Jewel being questioned story, but here stands in for the entirety of the local press and indeed symbolically the media more broadly. And to call her portrayal an over-the-top caricature would be inappropriate only in the sense that it's too soft a description for what amounts to a character assassination. It's really bizarre to see Wilde, who's one of the more interesting actresses of her generation and who just had a really big year as director of the excellent Booksmart, show up in this kind of role. One understands wanting to work with someone who, hypothetically, used to be important like Eastwood, but really? For this? In any case, the character is introduced ranting about hating her small town, wanting a boob job, and how all of the ordinary, regular-looking, nice women at the office who write small-town human interest stories hate her because she's a gorgeous mean girl who looks like Olivia Wilde, and her hot, sexy crime and murder stories get more coverage than them. And she doesn't care. We soon find out that she gets her hot crime leads by sleeping with police and FBI agents, and when the bombing occurs, we see her start to pray, but it turns out she's not praying for the victims, she's asking God to please make the bomber turn out to be someone interesting so she can turn it into a big story and become more famous and maybe move to the big city.
I read somewhere that their periods attract bears. The bears can smell the menstruation.
Well, that's just great. You hear that, Ed? Bears. Now you're putting the whole station in jeopardy.
No, really, this is in the movie. It's an embarrassingly one-note, evil-for-no-reason bad guy turn, completely at odds with the bent-over-backwards nuance that the film shows toward the fact that Jewel, while he was, in fact, totally innocent and exonerated, did, in fact, fit the profile right down to a bunch of behavior complaints in the past and a suspicious gun collection. And while Eastwood has never been thought of as a consistent champion of strong female characters, the open disdain for a certain type of professional-class women has seldom felt more petty and vindictive, to the point of completely derailing the story and message, especially since apparently none of this seems to be true. There's no concrete evidence that the real-life Kathy Scruggs did anything other than ambitiously pursue high-value stories, including this one, and while she was one of the primary breakers of the story itself, there's no indication she was specifically vindictive to Jewel personally, and the allegation that she traded sex for police leads is apparently so without merit that the newspaper she worked at is seeking legal action against the producers of the film. The actual Kathy Scruggs, of course, isn't around to defend herself. She died several years ago, so that's convenient. Now, obviously there's an element of almost hilariously blatant hypocrisy at play here in a movie about the media slandering of a private citizen itself making its points by slandering a different private citizen. And more than a few folks have taken note of the perhaps interesting timing of Eastwood, a noteworthy right-wing conservative voice in the otherwise largely progressive-minded film industry, putting out a version of this story that reframes the narrative as a dubiously fictionalized conspiracy between the deep state FBI and an uppity female journalist to frame a noble working-class white guy right in the middle of the Trump impeachment, but I don't know if the problem needs to be anything that sinister, to be honest. From where I sit, the problem is that the real Richard Jewell story is sad, certainly, but it's also sad in a complicated way that most people don't want to hear, i.e. a way that doesn't make a simple crowd-pleasing movie narrative. You see, most stories about the media are really stories about the audience. The idea that the media is this big brain genius entity manipulating the innocent public to do this or buy that against their basic will is ridiculously overblown in the public imagination because it lets the people off the hook. We didn't act like animals on Black Friday or jump to conclusions about a news story or ignore something bad happening right in front of us. The media made us do it, when in reality the media, speaking as someone who kind of works there, is a business, so if no one was asking for whatever, they wouldn't be broadcasting whatever. And I was alive in 1996. I remember watching this whole shit show play out from start to finish, and even as a 16-year-old, I don't remember anyone remotely resembling Olivia Wilde popping up to use liberal media hypnotism powers to trick everyone into suspecting Richard Jewell. What I do remember is The Person is a Suspect story hit, and the public, and then following their lead, late-night comedians, daytime chat show hosts, local and national news, magazines, etc., following their lead and reflecting it back to them in a vicious bullshit cycle, pretty much immediately going, "Oh, hey, yeah, he is kind of fat and weird and too quiet and lives with his mom, isn't he? Huh, and hey, you know who he reminds me of? Jeff Gillooly, that weird guy from the last big Olympic scandal. Whoa, he must be guilty. And plus, he's funny looking, so we can make jokes about him, and that'll help us feel reassured about how scary this whole terrorist bombing thing was. In other words, feels to me like the film scuttles its own message by trying to take the easy way through. One bad guy the audience can hate is much simpler than an entire culture of bad guys the audience might have to recognize themselves in. Like I said up front, an honest version of this story wouldn't be approaching it from Richard Jewell, a life destroyed by the government and the media, and it could happen to you because he was an ordinary person just like you, but rather Richard Jewell, a life destroyed by ordinary people just like you. Earlier this month, for, no particular reason, I spent a few episodes talking about the changing perceptions of police in the popular culture and American police in the American popular media in particular. Given that these episodes are relatively short, or rather they're supposed to be, but sometimes I do get ahead of myself, but we're on a deadline today, so that will not be the case. I don't always get to put everything in, but there's a couple items in particular tangential to those prior pieces that a few viewers had asked about I wanted to get back to, and well, now's as good a time as any, I guess. As a refresher, since I thought it was safe to assume most people are familiar with the modern-day Law & Order, Chicago PD, Bad Boys, Lethal Weapon, Die Hard, etc. framing of TV procedural and action movie violent macho superhero version of fictional cops, the two earlier big picture episodes in reference focused on much earlier proto-examples, specifically the slapstick silent movie comedy team The Keystone Kops, which established the early image of police as comically ineffective cartoonish buffoons. And Jack Webb's genre-defining TV series Dragnet, which created the realistic police procedural concept and also helped establish that realism in this context meant beginning and ending with what police advisors working with Hollywood productions wanted reality to look like, and also gave us the whitest piece of music ever created when the series was parodied in the 1980s movie remake starring Tom Hanks and Dan Aykroyd.
You're a dangerous mob, and it is our job to bust you all for being violent. While we are here, let's state it clear.
You have the right to remain silent.
Now you know what you've been doing is a serious crime.
And you'll probably be doing some serious time.
In case you might be worried about the friends you lose.
At least I get to see you on the evening news.
It's a new sensation.
We go down to the station.
You're gonna answer some questions.
And have some refreshments.
But between then and now, other archetypes did emerge, grounded in both earlier versions of reverence and irreverence toward the role of uniformed law enforcement in popular culture, born out of a mass psychological tug-of-war between forces of a growing post-1960s discomfort with Dragnet-style cop worship, and anxieties over a very real increase in violent crime and the sensational media coverage thereof that made police seem even more necessary to many. There were, of course, a lot of complicated reasons for this, beginning of the ongoing evolution of the U.S. economy from a manufacturing and exporting power to a service culture and innovation-based power, a rapid demographic transformation of major cities during the Great Migration period of minority workers, and their families moving from southern to northern states, a general malaise following the collapse of the Nixon era and the Vietnam War. Either way, things got bad, people were angry, yada yada, something ironically topical. Anyway, this is where the bad cop who's actually a good cop shows up as a new kind of police hero in movies and TV, the guy who echoes certain audiences' frustrations about the government and police not being able to just fix things, damn it, gets results and doesn't play by the rules. Even if you've never seen the movies themselves, you probably know that this originates with an actually really good 1971 Clint Eastwood movie called Dirty Harry, which had a bunch of not as good sequels and features Clint as a San Francisco police detective who has a big-ass .44 Magnum that he uses to blow the heads off criminals who piss him off. Here's what you might not know about Dirty Harry. At the time, it was basically viewed as kind of schlocky and even in slightly poor taste as a big-budget studio movie goes, mainly because it was actually doing the Law & Order ripped from the headlines fantasy version of current events thing with a still ongoing unsolved murder case, sort of. In the film, the villain is a serial killer called Scorpio who taunts the police and media with messages about his targets and uses dirty legal tricks to escape prosecution until only Dirty Harry Callahan is able to bring him down by defying his orders and just straight up chasing the bad guy down and getting into a gunfight with him. Pretty much everyone could tell this was meant to be an audience catharsis what-if fantasy happy ending version of the Zodiac killer murders, which at the time had been a prominent symbol of loss of faith in the ability of law enforcement to do anything about modern crime. But what's also obscured by the way basically 80 to 90% of cop movies after this copied the Dirty Harry character and the way its own sequels would sanitize him is that in the film, Harry Harry is not really a great dude either. The film's own trailer referred to it as the story of two killers, and much of the narrative is devoted to hammering the audience with evidence that Harry is either severely unwell or just an actual psychopath himself who happens to be of very specific use in these very specific situations. His colleagues don't like him, he doesn't seem to have friends, his nickname isn't a compliment, it's there because the other cops think it's almost funny to make him do all the most suicidally dirty, dangerous jobs that no one else will take, and Eastwood plays his cold, emotionless affect as a default setting to the point where his moments of outrage seem suspiciously practiced. That doesn't mean Dirty Harry is anti-cop by any means, rather its worldview is almost apocalyptic, depicting a version of urban America so ravaged by apathy, violence, and general collapse that not only can a malevolent force like Scorpio emerge and run rampant, the only thing that can stop him is something almost as deranged and out of control, a monster to kill a monster, which, as noted, gets sanitized because audiences enjoy seeing the bad guy get what for catharsis of the original so much that they made sequels where Harry evolved into a more traditional heroic figure who would get girlfriends, grow as a person, etc. In fact, the first sequel, Magnum Force, featured as the villains a whole secret society of cruel, rhetoric-spouting vigilante cops who conspire to murder criminals who escape justice in the courts, just so the franchise can make it very clear that there are bad cops who go too far, but Dirty Harry isn't one of them, and he'll beat them up. And if you think that is as bizarrely mixed up as cop movies, pop culture politics can get, alright, so we started in these various episodes about police media, just because, and people kept asking me to do the Police Academy movies, or at least the first one, and we're gonna wrap up and get to that today, but I need to clarify up front, this isn't some kind of franchise deep dive into the series, because I just can't. It's Police Academy, there isn't that much there, and I'm also pretty sure the home media rights to it are still with Warner Brothers, and they're such a pain in my ass about using clips on YouTube, and you just have no idea. So this is more like an overview, okay? Alright, so to attempt to understand why a low-budget, not terribly original or inventive movie called Police Academy was such a big hit in 1984 to spawn 6 more sequels over a decade, you kinda need the context that one of the biggest things in comedy at that time were ensemble movies where instead of having a single strong main plot, you had a more general narrative direction carrying a big cast of characters who were all grouped together by virtue of a single location like a job, school, whatever. Kinda like a sitcom, which might be why they don't really make these anymore. I think that the last one that was big and really tried was Waiting, which wasn't that much of a hit. There was one recently that was sort of like about a Hooters type restaurant called Support the Girls that was really more like a smarter subversion of the genre that also not a lot of people saw. Actually really good though. Anyway, this was all largely because of the success of a movie called Caddyshack. If you're under 20, I guess ask your dad or another guy roughly dad aged. He probably really likes it. I really like it. Or a granddad. He probably really loves it. Which sort of happened by accident, Caddyshack that is. See, Caddyshack was supposed to be this kind of American graffiti-style coming-of-age comedy about 2 working-class teenagers figuring out their post-high school lives while working one summer as golf caddies at a snooty country club. For extra laughs, the filmmakers had cast the more colorful grown-up supporting roles, mostly with longtime comedy veterans like Ted Knight and Rodney Dangerfield, and also popular then-new sketch and stand-up and improv stars like Chevy Chase and Bill Murray. Unfortunately, everything kind of went wrong while they were making the movie. The director and crew were mostly newcomers who didn't really have their footing. The shoot was plagued by bad weather, causing everyone to be stuck indoors with nothing to do but, like, drugs and partying that went with drugs, supposedly, so the shoot was a mess and most of the actual footage turned out to be unusably bad. But since all the seasoned comedy pros they hired for the secondary roles were seasoned comedy pros, all their stuff was still very funny. So the producers threw out all but the bare minimum of the original sort of dramedy coming-of-age stuff, used as many scenes of the funny guys being funny as they could, and reworked the whole thing into this shaggy, not really plot-driven, but resultingly very funny stuff happening at a golf course to a bunch of characters over the summer, and it was a gigantic hit. And then like 1,000 movies tried to rip it off on purpose and were mostly all bad. Seriously, basically all of them. Every guy my age likes at least one of these way too much, and they'll try to convince you that Hot Dog the movie or Stewardess School or Joystick or whatever is good because they watched it when they were 12 and there was one iconically funny scene and some then like attractive iconic actress and this is the movie where she got the twins out, but really they're all bad. Like, Caddyshack is the only one of these that's a great film, and that happened by accident. So anyway, Police Academy was the one of these that crossed a cop comedy with Animal House, because on paper that sounds like a great idea. And also, as you might have guessed, sounds like something that you'd have to make a little bit interesting socio-politically, because your characters being police with all that attendant authority and the specter of coercive state power, but in Police Academy's case, interesting just ends up meaning confused. The starting premise is that an unidentified city's new lady mayor is responding to a police shortage by ordering the police training academy to accept new recruit applications from all backgrounds of genders, race, body type, etc., and at least giving them a shot, even if they're weird, goofy misfits who are obviously unqualified by conventional standards. So at first you think, oh, okay, this is a reactionary Reagan-era movie mocking the concept of affirmative action, which is basically the case. But then we meet the principal villain in the Academy's dickhead instructor Harris, played by G.W. Bailey, who in the mandatory Dean Wormer role dislikes all the good guys for being fun, relatable audience surrogates and schemes to force them all to quit the Academy in order to make the mayor's plan look bad, because he's a jerk who thinks only certain people deserve to be cops. So actually it's a pro-diversity in hiring movie, or maybe nuanced?
She ran over my feet! I'm sorry. I really am. Sorry? You dumb fat jigaboo!
Oh, shit. At ease, Hightower. At ease. If you don't stop, you are out of here! Mister, I am warning you, Hightower!
Well, it's not really either, is the thing. It's a misfit fraternity movie, largely borrowed wholesale from Animal House and Revenge of the Nerds, that doesn't really seem to consider the implications of transposing those narratives onto cops beyond they get to have guns and the uniforms and that'll make it funny. The central likable misfit as catch-all marginalized metaphor angle here is even more strained than in the X-Men franchise, with Steve Guttenberg's lead character Mahoney, a guy who basically just likes to goof off and has a problem with authority, being grouped together with characters who are actually capable but have personality issues or are victims of actual straight-up racism from the other cadets, or like overweight, and also at least one guy who seems to be an actual psychopath, and Kim Cattrall, who is a woman. Like, that's her whole misfit thing, she's a lady. It's all very confused, which is weird for a film that has so little foundation that they never bother to establish where it's actually taking place. That's not to say it doesn't have a few funny beats, but it also feels like the main reason this became a long-running franchise is that it was easier to get people back together for this than it was for other bigger films of the era. Then again, any attempt at making what's basically Keystone Kops for the Law & Order Reagan years was always going to be self-confused, simultaneously trying to indulge an audience by mocking authority while also letting them enjoy scenes where authority triumphed over fears of lawlessness. In other words, the narrative movie version of every dude who loves the police until he's the one getting pulled over. The last one of these came out in 1994, with many failed attempts at a reboot since then. There was also an animated series, because of course there was. I don't know that I can recommend actually, like, binging through these today, but since you asked, yeah, that was Police Academy. There's a phrase you may or may not be familiar with on social media called milkshake duck, or milkshake ducking. If you're not, don't worry, it means you have an actual life and are therefore much happier. That's inspired by a sort of famous tweet, which unfortunately is a concept that exists, that originally referred to those moments when some cool new person, artist, creation, etc. that you just became a fan of turns out to be, let's say, problematic very soon after, but at this point tends to mean the sense that it hasn't happened yet, but is probably going to, i.e., she's funny, I hope she's not a milkshake duck, or I like this band's sound, but some of the lyrics, I feel like they're one or two albums away from milkshake ducking it and it's gonna bum me out. Indie movie writer-director S. Craig Zoller, late of Bone Tomahawk, Brawl in Cell Block 99, and the screenplay for the reboot of Puppet Master, which sucked, is currently the #1 with a bullet milkshake duck of the grindhouse movie circuit, an undeniably talented auteur filmmaker with all of the right premillennial film geek influences and genre bona fides who, at least when he's directing his own stuff, tends to hit the center mass nexus of near-pornographic ultraviolence, swaggering macho bravado, intelligently textured dialogue, and smart deliberative pacing that's catnip to a strong strain of cinephile. Basically, if you want to get crass about it, he makes Bill Lustig movies, but he directs them like they're Bill Wellman movies. But what's put an extra edge on his stuff are some film writers, that is that he likes to traffic in subject matter, imagery, topics, and in some cases actors and collaborators that most present-day filmmakers tend to bend over backwards both in front of and behind the camera to clarify that they're not endorsing by depicting police violence, racism, extreme right-wing nationalism, demonization of minorities, brutal misogyny, etc., and not really doing that, i.e. the clarifying part. His Western, his prison movie, and his revisionist take on the Nazi black magic aspect of the Puppet Master franchise all dive headlong into the most, if you'll pardon the obnoxious, tiresome phrasing, politically incorrect, button-pushing regions of their subject matter with a boldness that can be exhilarating but also disquieting. Like when a friend shows you some really messed up stuff from the web on their phone and you go, haha, yeah, that's pretty nasty. Why do you have that? Like, what could you possibly have been looking for to land on that? Those who've already decided that Zahler must be a not-so-closeted reactionary certainly won't be dissuaded by the presence of Mel Gibson and returning Brawl in Cell Block 99 star Vince Vaughn as the leads of Drag Across Concrete. In any case, nor Zahler's provocative casting of the actors as a pair of grumpy, racist, misfit cops who decide to plan a heist while on a 6-week unpaid suspension for the excessive beating of a suspect, which they don't so much disagree was excessive as they do that it should be that big of a deal. Parallel running storylines follow Toby Kittles and Michael Jai White, refreshingly cast for his acting rather than his fighting skills for a change, as drivers hired as the wheelmen for said initial heist, and the heavily armed masked psychopaths pulling off the job itself, while slow-burning subplots track Mel Gibson's MS-afflicted wife, who worries that she's turning into a racist herself because she's worried about her daughter being bullied in their mostly black low-income neighborhood, and Vaughn's attempt to buy an engagement ring for his girlfriend, which is complicated for some of the same reasons. And it's a Zahler movie, so it runs about 3 hours long, and these threads take their sweet time playing out before colliding in a brutal, nihilistically violent payoff staged like an old-school western in a modern, gritty setting. Viewed largely as an attempt at self-elevation, a move away from the more straightforward genre thrills of his previous two films and into something more like a formal drama punctuated by moments of signature extreme violence and unnerving this-feels-too-real nastiness from the uniformly dark-natured characters and even more unnerving sense of sympathy for their darker instincts, Drag Across Concrete is a solid crime film that makes a nice showcase for Zahler's florid dialogue and penchant for leisurely long takes and jarring violence, but it also feels at times like a sense of limitation setting in. It's probably the least engaging of his films as a result, a reminder that even if expanding lurid exploitation-style cop movies to epic length is an interesting experiment, there's probably a reason that most of these get pared down to run as quick as possible. Also, for all the critical hand-wringing about whether or not Zahler is or isn't the first filmmaker with a reactionary and/or right-of-center socio-political skew in several decades between John Milius and now to actually make good movies, and unavoidably controversial co-presence of the equally repellent yet talented Mel Gibson, who, yes, is about as good here as he's been in anything, this is also the first time I felt like Zahler has kind of pulled his punches a bit in that regard. We are shown enough of the cops just being grouchy and beaten down by life to get where they're meant to be coming from. We see what's going on with Gibson's daughter, that she's mostly catching schoolyard bullying and not much else. The two wheelmen are extremely sympathetic and thoughtful, and the actual robbers might as well be Machine Gun Jason Voorhees and so forth. So for all the nastiness around him, it comes off sort of like a cop-out. If you're going to ask us to wallow in this there are no good guys, everyone's just some variation of bastard muck for 3 hours, fine, but let them be bastards. For a movie that was pitched as being the mainstream-ish breakout for the most dangerous filmmaker on the indie scene, it's kind of a letdown to see Zahler seeming to sand down his own edges and hand in something more like an extra-long, very talky, much more handsome-looking episode of Chicago PD. It's interesting, the payoff is very good, and it's nice to see actors that you don't normally see getting to do these kind of performances do this kind of movie, but in the end, it's really just okay. 5 out of 10.
You know, it's weird to consider that the Bad Boys movies have all come out so far apart that they all play more like commentaries on themselves and their genre than they do like actual movies. There's really only two recurring main characters, and Joey Pants as the captain. He's the only one who could be said to be inhabiting a character rather than a riff on an outside-the-frame established celebrity persona, and while the fact of Will Smith, if he was a cop, teamed with Martin Lawrence if he was also a cop, overtakes the meta-narrative of the Marcus and Lowry characters in Part 2, the aggressive commitment to we know this doesn't matter non-storytelling in the actual narrative keeps the original's not spoken aloud but widely understood main genre conceit thumping at the heart of things. Let's revive the bad taste, shoot first, socially irresponsible police work as urban warfare buddy cop movies of the 80s, but this time both characters are the hip funny black comedian from a TV show. And you know, the fact that this has endured as some kind of a brand more or less says that it clearly worked, right? I mean, not bad when you consider that before they decided they were going in a different direction with the casting, the first one was supposed to be a vehicle for John Lovitz and Dana Carvey, coasting entirely on the here's every cop cliche ever and it's funny because because we named the movie after the theme song from Cops, but plug 2 rising star sitcom actors and a young action director out to prove he can make anything look exciting, and they had a hit. And then everyone involved became much more famous, so it took 8 years to do another one that's generally remembered as one of the most over-the-top violent and explosive films of its type, sequel or otherwise, and now, almost but not quite 20 years later, people have had some career ups and downs, so it's time to do a third one and see if there's any blood left in this stone, though this time without original director Michael Bay, and some screenwriting gymnastics to account for Martin Lawrence not exactly having kept in peak action hero shape over the last few decades, let's say, at least not like Will Smith has. So in case you've forgotten your Bad Boys lore, don't worry about it, there isn't any. They're two best friends who are detectives in Miami. Will Smith is the cool one who's rich and wears cool suits and dates models, and Lawrence is the frustrated married guy who lives in the suburbs and gets nagged by his wife, which is her whole character, with both of them getting too old for this shit, but only Lawrence's character feeling up for retirement. Their hand gets forced when a new crop of bad guys on the streets nearly kill Smith off for good, leading Martin to swear a promise of pacifism to God while Will swears revenge and re-enlists with a new crew, largely comprised of, yes, younger, tech-savvy millennial cops who regard him as a legendary but out-of-touch older mentor, so that the second act can be all about generational gap jokes, with Smith being bamboozled by new police technology and 21st century procedures, and of course the younger characters being shown old school tricks and the usual stuff you're expecting while minor character details get dropped. You know, just in case this veritable Burger King Kids Club of new characters clicks enough to get their own spin-off. They're not gonna get their own spin-off. Though only Paula Nunes makes any real impact as the ostensible leader, and of course it's not long at all before Lawrence is reluctantly pulled back into the storyline anyway. The villains this time, of course, are the Mexican cartels, because every action movie screenwriter in Los Angeles binged Narcos 5 years ago on Netflix, and now this is the default set of generic bad guys for every goddamn movie like this. They at least have a sort of colorful leader in Kate Castillo as a Santeria practicing bruja boss, with a vendetta against the main heroes that I thought was going to tie back to the second movie in a fun way, but turns out to just tie back to some new shit they made up for this one, which is disappointing to say the least, and turns out to involve a very dumb retcon that's, granted, you know, one doesn't just attend a Bad Boys movie for the plot, it's for the action scenes and the comic interplay, and while there are a few certain bangers here, including at least one expertly executed surprise twist kill and an absolute knockout of a club fight to shootout to car chase to chopper fight sequence that acts as the main highlight, plus some solid shoot-em-up moments in between, yeah, it does me no joy to report that you can't take 1/3 of the Michael Bay, Will Smith, Martin Lawrence cocktail away and expect it to still work. I mean, the new directors aren't bad. That would be Adil El Arabi and Bilal Fallah from Belgium. They both hand in solid work, and they clearly have a future wrangling American action blockbusters. They're already signed to do Beverly Hills Cop 4 for Eddie Murphy. I'm sure they'll do fine, but without the Bayhem signature to the action beats, Bad Boys for Life mostly feels like another action film. Not a bad one, but not really anything special, apart from the vague sense of connection to a movie franchise that's old enough to be a nostalgic reference to itself instead of its own references. So yeah, I'll give this one 6 out of 10. It's entertaining enough. I do appreciate some of the more subtle throwouts to the previous movies for the fans. There's a decent effort at making sure the chemistry still lands organically, and it does. And the fans who just wanted to see the characters again will no doubt leave more or less satisfied. I can't call it a must-see, though.
Paul Verhoeven's original 1987 RoboCop is my favorite movie ever. That doesn't mean I think it's the best movie ever, or that it's a perfect movie, or that you can't touch it, or anything else specific like that. It just happens to be my favorite. Part of that probably involves specific circumstance. I was 6 when it came out, and I didn't see it until I was at least 8. But I loved RoboCop right off the bat as a kid because, well, it was about robots, and cops, and explosions, and bigger robots. But also because it was about blood, and boobs, and swear words, and all kinds of other stuff I knew I wasn't supposed to be seeing. And there were action figures too, which was good, because then you could recreate scenes from the movie once your parents realized it was rated R and wouldn't actually let you watch it again.
RoboCop! Criminals, give up! Surprise, RoboCop! Meet your match!
But what really cemented it for me is that unlike every single other goofy damn thing I loved as a kid, when I watched RoboCop again as what today passes for an adult, RoboCop actually got better. Yeah, the robots and the blood and the boobs are all still there, but it's also a good movie. In fact, it's a great movie, easily among the very best of the 1980s and one of the best action movies ever, and I'd argue one of the great all-time modern science fiction films, right up there with Blade Runner and Moon. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. RoboCop is smart, not pretentious, not ponderous, not straining unnecessarily hard for greater depths or ladling on a bunch of heavy-handed heavy-handed symbolic narrative because it doesn't trust its own foundational building blocks. No, the whole thing just feels beat for beat, scene for scene, like they went over the whole damn script and every step of the way asked themselves, what's the smart decision we could make here? The film's premise is very simple. It's the near future in the once great city of Detroit, Michigan. Crime is so bad and the city is so broke that the mayor has sold control of the police force to a corporation called Omni Consumer Products. With the outraged cops threatening to strike rather than become mere OCP employees, the company is looking into alternative forms of law enforcement. Old guard corporate jerkface Dick Jones wants to replace cops with robots called Ed 209s, but they keep malfunctioning. So instead, fresh young corporate jerkface Bob Morton gets the go-ahead for his replacement cop project, which involves using cyborgs with human brains. And not long after reassigning the city's most reliable officers to its most hopelessly crime-blighted areas, wouldn't you know it, they wind up with a perfect candidate when a do-gooder super cop named Alex Murphy gets blown to pieces by the drug kingpin and gang leader Clarence Boddicker. Morton's OCP team get a hold of the remains and Frankenstein's Murphy's corpse and brain into RoboCop, who is awesome. Like, if the whole rest of the movie was just that, we'd be fine, right? But instead, things start to unravel. RoboCop recovers some of his human memories and sets out to solve his own murder. But when he moves to take down Boddicker...
I work for Dick Jones! Dick Jones! He's the #2 guy at OCP!
And then he goes to take down Dick Jones... It turns out OCP dropped a secret directive into RoboCop's programming that makes him unable to take action against what are, after all, his employers. Geez, it's as though letting private business interests be in control of public law enforcement is a terrible idea. Fortunately, RoboCop is rescued by his former partner who helps him repair his wounds, eliminate Boddicker's gang, and expose Dick Jones, first to his colleagues and then to high-altitude oxygen.
Dick, you're fired!
Thank you.
Oh, and they also get to douse one of the bad guys in toxic waste, so he turns into melty goo and then gets liquefied by a car crash. Oh, this movie is so awesome. But yeah, this is your basic sci-fi action premise. Cyborg hero, bad guy, bad robot, action scenes, one-liners, but it never takes the easy route and it makes smart decisions where other lesser movies might go dumb just for expediency. And as a result, it makes what's already a darkly satirical premise even darker and more cutting. For example, OCP are not good guys. They openly admit that their long-term goal in Detroit is gutting and gentrifying its inner city to create an autonomous company town called Delta City. But they're not cartoonishly evil either. Even Dick Jones has layers. One of the reasons he prefers Ed 209 over RoboCop is that turning people into cyborgs kind of skeeves him out. Speaking of Ed 209, though, it's one of the all-time great examples of benefiting by doing the unexpected. We've seen enough movies, played enough video games, etc. to know a boss fight monster when we see one. And while RoboCop vs. Ed is briefly fun to see, it's more fun to see the big dumb robot put to use as a recurring joke at the expense of a bloated, bungling, hopelessly inept defense industry. Like how they probably spent billions in research and development in this sucker and never once considered how it's supposed to, say, negotiate stairs. But the main overriding smart thing about this movie, focus. Like I said, OCP aren't the bad guys, but they are bad guys. And when the movie opens, they've already taken over the police and are well on the way to creating Delta City. And when it ends, that's still the case. RoboCop stops Boddicker's immediate crime wave and the one genuinely evil executive, but OCP isn't going anywhere. It's not even brought up as a possibility. Now that's good for story purposes, because instead of getting bogged down in some big speechifying symbolic fight the power narrative, the film can stay grounded in the personal human story of Murphy reclaiming his lost humanity. But it helps invest the film's ever-present notes of 80s political and pop culture satire.
I'd buy that for $1.
With a much darker, omnipresent edge. The bad guys already won. And that was the real big overriding take that RoboCop was delivering to Mr. and Mrs. unsuspecting 80s movie audience. It wasn't just that an amoral corporate oligarchy had seized control of a quintessential American metropolis and implicitly America itself, or that the news media had been reduced to pretty faces regurgitating propaganda, or that mainstream entertainment was dumbing down to mollify the masses. It was that RoboCop's world was already like that before the first shots were fired, and would continue to be like that no matter how satisfying the hero's own personal victory history might be in the short term, because his future was really our present. Of course, everything else that's come out of the franchise since has managed to screw that up. RoboCop 2 is a thuddingly stupid, obvious movie where OCP basically is a bunch of Captain Planet villains, and RoboCop 3 doubles down on dated early 90s Japanophobia. And of course, there's a remake coming out this week. Those of you who watched this past week's Big Picture, and why wouldn't you have unless you're trying to hurt my feelings, would know that I have a particular affection for the original 1987 classic RoboCop. Not so much its sequels or spin-offs, but the original, love it to death. The reason I so adore RoboCop can be neatly summed up by its violence and its brains. It's a brutal, uncompromising action film that also excels in smart, complex storytelling. Though it takes broad satirical aim at 1980s pop culture and American politics, it does so with a rare level of sophistication and awareness, punctuating sarcastic jabs at then-contemporary consumer entertainment with a thoroughly sincere pan to the heroic cowboy gunslinger mythology and dismantling the rosy veneer of Reagan-era corporate capitalism without descending into cheap and easy good guy, bad guy moralism, effectively skewering dozens of worthy targets while acknowledging the complexity of the world they shared. And now, here, descending from that lofty pedigree, comes an all-new, mega-budget 21st century RoboCop that takes the form of a PG-13 rated 110-minute grade school lecture about how drone warfare is a really, really bad, naughty thing for meanie poos. Yeah, this kind of sucks.
I'd buy that for $1.
Our story, sometime in the near future, Michael Keaton is the head of OCP, a massive global robotics company that has somehow managed to dominate the private defense industry despite being run by a CEO whose skill set does not extend beyond dressing badly and babbling about how evil he is, how evil his schemes are, and how much more evil OCP is going to do so that even the thickest skulled knob in the audience won't be confused as to who the bad guys are. Anyway, OCP makes its money selling Terminators, Metal Gears, and Bad News Bears to be used for militarized urban pacification and policing in every country on Earth except the United States, which is inexplicably somehow the most prized and valuable market for their products, even though, because this is a neutered, family-safe PG-13 movie, we never see or get a sense of any criminality beyond what one guy with a stun gun can handle. No, I'm not kidding about that. The new RoboCop, named for a character and corresponding film universally associated with one of the highest body counts and bloody action sequences in movie history, carries a f***ing stun gun. But yeah, OCP wants to turn the tide of American opinion to repeal the laws that ban the use of drones and robots on US soil. When do-gooder Detroit detective Alex Murphy is wounded in a convenient car bomb, the company steps up to save his life by rebuilding him as RoboCop, a cyborg with all the strength, skill, and onboard app store abilities of a drone, but with the all-important difference of a human conscience. But not really. RoboCop actually functions just like one of OCP's other drones, but with programming that tricks Murphy's brain, and presumably anyone who might ask him about it, into believing that his programmed or remote-controlled actions are actually his own conscious decision-making. This is actually a fairly interesting twist, with the potential to throw both RoboCop and the audience off guard about the nature of criminality in his world and his own place therein. A smart modernization of the Directive 4 twist from the original. Or it would be if it weren't simply revealed to the audience at the outset, forcing us to wait around impatiently for RoboCop to solve a mystery we already know the solution to. You might think that since Murphy's wife and son stick around as supporting characters this time, the idea might be to observe RoboCop's slow crawl back to humanity from their perspective, but nope, they're just on hand because someone decided what this franchise really needed was a damsel in distress. Oh, speaking of which, Nancy Allen's no-nonsense, decidedly atypical Detective Lewis character is in this version just a guy. The whole film feels like that. An empty, hollow, tediously self-referencing cover version of a better movie. Corny message-mongering instead of insightful moral ambiguity. Slick, bloodless CGI combat instead of gory, tactile action. It wants to give the impression that it has ideas and is about something, but without real conviction, and always in the stupidest way possible. For example, the film opens with Ed 209s, and don't get me started on how completely they've missed the point of that, fighting suicide bombers in US-occupied Iran, which sounds edgy and relevant until you notice there's no context. Why is America in Iran? Did their government collapse? Was there a war, an invasion? Is it a NATO operation? What kind of world-reshaping events have triggered this? Ha! No chance. We aren't even told what the ideology, motive, or alignment of the suicide bombers is. It's just a newsworthy-sounding thing in a newsworthy-sounding location because they think that's all it'll take to make vapid audiences think something meaningful is going on. Ahem. Meanwhile, in the main narrative, whereas the RoboCop of 3 decades prior grappled with being both man and machine in starkly intellectual terms, seeking solace without the possibility of easy answers, the modern Alex Murphy is implied to be overriding his OCP programming in ways the scientists just plain old can't account for, through the indomitable strength of the human soul. No, for real. And you know they aren't kidding about this because they make sure one of the batty-waddy science guys brings it up and rolls their eyes all cynical-like. Subtlety. Hey, movie, if I wanted to watch Touched by an Angel, I'd actually dig my eyeballs out with a melon baller first, but I think you get the point. Look, it's not really possible to judge a remake of RoboCop in absence of the original, since the pop notoriety of the original as a classic work of sci-fi cinema is the only reason this exists in the first place. And in that respect, its existence is outright criminal, an act of artistic vandalism whose idea of satire is dragging in a hilariously bored-looking Samuel L. Jackson for expository comedy sketches spoofing the easy target Fox News aesthetic that'll be hilarious providing you've never once heard of Stephen Colbert. The only thing sadder than this movie is the realization that audience who do want a movie that expertly blends insightful, cutting consumer culture satire with genre-redefining action-of-interest storytelling, much like the original RoboCop did, are actually, no joke, better off just going to see the Lego Movie again. But even taken on its own merits, well, it doesn't have any merits. It's a totally disposable, generic action film devoid of a single redeeming feature, embodied perfectly by a stiflingly charisma-free blank slate lead performance by Joel Kinnaman as Murphy. Apparently I'm supposed to have heard of this guy because he's on some damn cable show, but I honestly spent a good part of the movie trying to figure out if this was Sam Worthington, Joel Edgerton, or some other forgettable, interchangeable white dude Hollywood keeps insisting is a movie star.
This is Katana. She's got my back.
On the plus side, well, hey, congratulations, every other movie of 2014. The bar has already been set about as low as it can get. I'm glad I didn't buy that for $1.